What's up, gamers? I'm the Cobra Commander, Master Marcolian, Lancer Tank Lieutenant, and Orbital Strike Operator.
Yeah, hi.
Today on the Freeroll, we're breaking down meta cards for Marcolians. This is part 1 in my series on mastering Marcolian play in Parallel TCG. Make sure you follow or subscribe so that you don't miss anything. Because these videos are intended for beginners, I am not going to assume that you know anything about Parallel. Every Marcolian deck starts out with 3 copies of Crimson Fleet Machinist. It's a 1-energy, 1/2 unit, and its muster ability is to draw a random vehicle unit from your deck. Muster abilities are an ability that is activated when you play the unit to the field. Crimson Fleet Machinist also has a second ability. It gives +0/+1 to any vehicle unit that is played while it's on the field. So this sets up quite nicely. Most people want to have a limited number of vehicles in their deck so that they have a good idea of what they're going to draw when they play Crimson Fleet Machinist. And typically they're looking for low-cost vehicles like Longbow Personel Carrier so that they can play that on curve. On curve means that you're playing a card that costs the amount of energy that you have that turn. So on turn 3, that's going to be a 3-cost card. On turn 4, that's going to be a 4-cost card. There are very few cards in the game of Parallel that give you as much as Crimson Fleet Machinist does for just 1 energy. When you have 2 1-energy units available on turn 2 and one of them is the heavy weapons team, that's a nice spot to put it down. It sets you up with Assault for turn 3, which is often when you're going to be looking to play Longbow Personnel Carrier, which does require Assault. It's a second or third unit for your board. It's also a bit harder to clear because it has 4 health. I don't love playing Heavy Weapons Team on turn 1 because it can't attack, which means you don't have any option for trading. However, if you've got it in your hand, it's the only option on turn 1. It's still better than nothing, of course. Moving on, we have 2 more 1-energy Marcolian units that are very popular options for your deck. Marcolian Bannerman, which is a 1-energy, 1/2 unit that gets +1/+1 every time you play an effect, as well as Trigger Happy Trooper, which is a 1-cost 2/2 unit that deals 1 damage to both players every time it attacks. These are both really useful cards. First, the Trigger Happy Trooper is an excellent turn 1 option because it has 2 damage plus 2 health, which means it's a little bit harder to remove early, and it can kill anything that gets played on turn 1 by itself in a trade. Even more important than that, though, doing damage to both players on attack is really important in case an early defender hits the board. That's going to allow you to trigger Assault without actually having an attack that makes it all the way through to the enemy player. The Marcolian Bannerman is similarly an important card and a very popular turn 1 option as well. That's because Marcolian Bannerman gets buffed on effects, and Marcolians have access to some inexpensive effects that might be getting played early on. More importantly, you can combo these things together. So a very popular opening for Marcolians is to start out with the Bannerman, and you're doing this anytime that you have a PS8 launcher in hand. That's because on turn 2, you're going to be looking to play a second 1-energy unit, sometimes another Marcolian Bannerman, and then the PS8 launcher to kill something that they have played on their turn 1. That's going to buff your Bannerman as well as remove an enemy unit at the same time, which is really efficient use of 1 energy. It's also extra helpful because that buff means that your Bannerman can now be a much more efficient trader if you decide to attack an enemy unit instead of the enemy player. Typical Marcolian decks are going to have anywhere from 10 to 15 1-cost units. My current deck has 14 of them. We've gone over 4 different options for you, and you can run up to 3 copies of each of those. That's going to get you to 12 right away. The most popular option to add beyond those 12 would be the universal card, Mercenary Gunslinger. This is a 1-cost 1/1 unit that we'll discuss during the Universal Cards for Marcolians video. The strategy that you're looking to employ typically is going to be to go wide as quickly as possible. There are some exceptions to that, but typically that is your best path to owning the game and winning quickly. And that means that on turn 2, it's generally going to be preferable to play 2 1-cost units over a single 2-cost unit. It's important that you think about that when you're deciding which cards to keep in your hand and which cards to mulligan. If you have a Crimson Fleet Machinist in your opening hand, it makes a big difference. The other thing that you need to consider is whether you're going first or second. The game will tell you when you're looking at your opening hand if you're going first or second. And when you're going second, you're going to be a bit more reactive to what your opponent is doing because they're acting before you. When you're going first, you get to set the stage. And that is definitely one of the spots where you're going to look to play 3 units in the first 2 turns. However, if you don't get the cards you need in your opening hand, I wouldn't force it and gamble too much for those cards, because if you're not able to stay on curve and use all of your energy in the early rounds, it's going to be very, very difficult to keep up. Moving on to 2-cost units, honestly, none of them are absolute must-haves for Marcolians. However, you have some interesting choices. My favorite is the Combat Veteran. It's a 2-cost 1/3 unit that gets +1/+1 every time it does combat damage. It has 3 health, which means that it's pretty difficult to remove right away. There are some options, but typically it's going to take 2 cards in the early game to remove a combat veteran. And even more importantly, it's going to buff every time it deals damage, so your opponents have to consider that in terms of trading and when they're making attacks. Anytime that you're able to attack a unit that has only 1 attack power, it's effectively not taking any damage because unless that 1 damage kills it, it's going to get buffed and get that health right back. If you're having trouble facing Shroud players, you might consider adding Unseen Commando. This is a 2-cost 2/1 unit with the assault ability of +1/+1. Even more importantly, it can't be targeted, which makes it a lot harder for Shroud players to banish because they do that with targeting effects. The Iron Core Rifleman is a popular choice as well. It's a 2-cost 2/2 unit with Armed. Armed is a keyword that means when it's attacking, it deals damage first, which means if it survives its first turn and starts to be able to attack, that it can be a very useful tool for trading. Another Marcolian card worth considering on turn 2 is Determined Assault. Determined Assault is a 2-energy effect that deals 3 damage to any target plus 3 damage to yourself. If you are going to use a Determined Assault on turn 2, I like it best if your turn 1 play was a Marcolian Bannerman so that it picks up a buff as well. Turn 3 is Longbow turn. Longbow Personnel Carrier is a 3-cost 0/4 defender with the assault ability Create 2 1/1 token units. This is a really important card for Marcolians as well, and probably the second most common card in Marcolian decks after the Crimson Fleet Machinist. And that's for a reason. Those cards go together. Most Marcolian players are going to pair Crimson Fleet Machinists with 3 copies of Longbow Personnel Carrier. Some of them will have that as their only vehicle units in the entire deck. They do that specifically so that they can only draw Longbow Personnel Carrier, which means as long as they have a Crimson Fleet Machinist on turn 1 or turn 2, then they will always have a Longbow Personnel Carrier in their hand to play on turn 3. Personally, I like to include a 4th or 5th vehicle unit in the deck as well, so that my late game Crimson Fleet Machinists are still drawing a card. Plus, there's a few vehicle units that are a little bit bigger and are very strong that you're typically going to want to include in your decks as well. We'll discuss those in future videos. Longbow Personnel Carrier is effectively 3 units for just 3 energy, and I told you many times already, our early strategy is to go wide quickly. On turn 3, you're going to often find yourself with a decision to make. It's very unlikely that they will have no units on the board at this point, and so you may be tempted to start trading. After all, you likely have an advantage on units at this point in the game. However, unless they are going to do something with that unit that you are really worried about, it's usually going to be better to continue filling the board and force them to trade into your units. Even more importantly, when you've played the Longbow Personnel Carrier on turn 3, that means you've got a defender. So you're likely going to have 2, 3, maybe even 5 small units on the board, but you're going to have a big defender as well. Remember, Longbow Personnel Carrier is going to pick up a +0/+1 buff as long as the Crimson Fleet Machinist that you played early is still on board, making it a 0/5 unit. There's going to be some games where 2 or even all 3 of the 1-drop units that you play on turns 1 and 2 are Crimson Fleet Machinist, meaning it gets to be 0/6 or 0/7 even really, really quickly. And that means that they're not going to be able to trade into your small units right away unless they've got some ability to remove that big defender. Even if you're going against a Shroud player that potentially has an erasure to get rid of your Longbow Personnel Carrier right away, we're totally fine with that. They're spending 3 energy to erase our 3 energy defender, but we still have the 1/1 units that were created as well. And that brings us to our final Meta Marcolian unit for today's discussion, Fire Support Base. It's a 2/5 defender that can't attack. However, it gives your all friendly units +1/+1. Remember, the early game strategy is to flood our board with as many units as possible, up to 6 of them in the first 3 turns. When this happens, it's very likely that 3 or more will last to turn 4 and receive the Fire Support Base buff. The decision that you need to make at this point is whether you're going to start trading into their units or attack face. Typically, attacking face is most desirable because you want to leverage these buffs to get your opponent into range to finish off with face attacks. However, it's going to be very dependent on the game you're playing and the opponent that you're going against. Against an Augencore player, for example, you don't really want to leave any small units on board because they can add a kill switch, which is an upgrade that will allow them to kill any of your units when their small unit dies, and that's going to make quick work of your Fire Support Base. Ideally, your Longbow Personnel Carrier will survive to the turn that you play Fire Support Base as well. When this happens, it means that you have 2 defenders on board. Importantly, the buff means that Longbow Personnel Carrier also has attack damage now as well, which means it can trade into some units or do some face damage, or even just dish some damage back to the opposing units when they attack. You're going to use your Longbow Personnel Carrier to protect your Fire Support Base, because Fire Support Base is giving the buff to all of your units, so make sure Longbow Personnel Carrier dies first. And when you've got 2 defenders on board, it's even easier to just let it rip and attack face. Be strategic about which units you leave on board, but typically this is a spot where you want to be more aggressive than your head is telling you to be. Finally, every Marcolian deck is going to feature face damage cards. There are 3 of them, and you can have 3 copies of each. For 1 energy, Crack Shot simply does 3 damage directly to the enemy. For 2 energy, Determined Assault does 3 damage to any target, meaning you can remove a unit as well. However, it also does 3 damage to yourself. Then we have Orbital Strike. For 5 energy, you can do 5 damage to any target. Again, this can be used to destroy many units. However, it's typically going to be a powerful finishing card. If you want to go max aggro, you can carry 3 copies of all 3 cards, and that's a total of 33 damage. So, in theory, you don't need to play units at all to win a game. In reality, units are going to do the majority of your attack damage, and you're going to be using face damage primarily to remove units and to finish games. The decision you need to make is how many and which ones you're going to carry. Typically, we see 5 or more of these cards in total in every deck. However, the mix can depend on the specific player quite a bit. Most players like the flexibility of Determined Assault. However, I tend to prefer the cheap cost of Crackshot. Orbital Strike is my favorite finisher because players often don't see it coming. However, it's a costly card. If you're just starting, I recommend 3 copies of Determined Assault, primarily because it's in the Marcolian starter deck, making them cheap to acquire, and they're very flexible cards. Add Crackshot, add 1 or 2 copies of Crackshot, and 1 or 2 copies of Orbital Strike as well to round it out. My current deck has exactly that. 3 copies of Determined Assault, 2 copies of Crackshot, and 1 copy of Orbital Strike. Okay, quick review. I gave you some flexibility here, but for simplicity's sake, the recommendations for today are 3 Crimson Fleet Machinists, 9 more 1-cost units. The 3 that we discussed were Marcolian Bannerman, Trigger Happy Trooper, and Heavy Weapons Team. 3 copies of Combat Veteran, 3 copies of Longbow Personnel Carrier, and 3 copies of Fire Support Base. Add in at least 6 more face damage cards as recommended, and that brings your Marcolian deck to 27 out of 40 already. We've included no legendaries, and it's entirely meta at this point. You're going to need 13 more cards to fill out your deck, and many of those are going to be the universal cards for Marcolians, which we will discuss in the next video. I hope you found this entertaining and informative. If you did, consider giving us a subscription or a follow on Twitter. That little free support goes a long way to support the channel.